Recruiter Table Talk. I am your host, Georgia Musgrave, and I'm welcomed and joined by my esteemed colleagues, Colleen Neese, Kristin Pozen, and Sharon Grace. And as always, we're here to share relevant topics in the arena of recruiting, and today is no different. Today's topic is all about how to give feedback to a hiring manager. And as you can imagine, we all have been there, right? It's not easy to give feedback, not when you consider whether it's your friends, whether it's your family. Can you just imagine having to give feedback to your employer or to the hiring manager that you're supporting on a particular search? Well, it's critical, right? That feedback and the way in which you provide feedback is given and often takes a level of empathy, honesty, and of course, expertise. And that's what our team of recruiters here today, our panelists, have to offer. And I hope that you can glean from them and it will help you on the job when you are working in finding the very best talent. So having said that, Kristin, all of these panelists have written articles on this exact topic. And so it's those topics that I'm going to be pulling out, specific areas within that we're going to glean a little bit more insight on. And I'm going to start with Kristin, if that's okay, put you on the spot. In your article, you really talked about the various issues that arise when there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And I think a lot of us have experienced that, whether it's with search committees or different levels within the hiring process. And so I'm really interested to have you share, Kristin, how do you deal with those multiple layers, especially with the increased level of bias that can ensue, maybe delays in the decision-making process? These are some of the outcomes that can occur that you've written about. How do you manage that overcrowding when it comes to feedback and giving feedback on it?
Yeah, and also one to add is confidentiality, right? You have all of these hiring leaders in trying to make a decision about who gets hired. And if there's, way too many folks involved in that decision, surely something's going to leak out, right? And that could put a candidate really in jeopardy with their current employer. It could look badly for the company itself that's doing the interviewing. That you start to get a bad reputation there. But, I think the main thing to focus on is the delayed decision making that happens when you have too many decision makers. Not only can they, maybe improperly bias some of the decisions because they may feel one way, but then their boss feels another way and they're in the meeting together. So they need to feel like they have to agree with their boss, that goes on. But then also just the fact that by having so many decision makers, it makes the process extremely long. And sometimes it's hard to keep our candidates engaged that long. They're interviewing with multiple companies for roles. Most often that's usually the case. We find these excellent candidates and they're out there trying to find the best fit for themselves. And if, a certain company is taking twice as long to get to their decision, then that's when the ghosting starts to happen, right? Right, Sharon and Colleen?
That's right. You're very, very spot on, Kristin.
Do you have examples like that as well, Colleen? I mean, have you or Sharon with this overcrowding and the impact it has on delays and what can be done about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say, as you know, I do a lot of CEO searches. So there's typically boards of directors are the decision makers. And what we do is within the boards of directors, we will identify search committee members. So we're trying to take the decision makers down a little bit. So instead of the entire board, it are certain people within the board who commit to the process. And Kristin spoke about how, the timing and the search processes can really be dragged out when you have a lot of people involved. And when you're dealing with board members, they've got very busy schedules. Some of them are, CEOs of their own companies that they're running. And so what we have found to be helpful is to really pre-schedule things and for these types of searches. And so what I mean by that is we will look at, when are we ideally looking to have this person start? and then we will work the recruitment and interview process backwards. And we will schedule interview dates that we are working towards. And then that way we are addressing the issue of the search ongoing forever. But we also will deal with situations where there are the varying opinions. And when you have a large group of decision makers, we need a process to figure out how are we going to come to an ultimate decision. So we typically assign a chair, and that's where a board chair or search committee chair, if they need to serve as the decision maker in certain situations, that's their job, or I help and facilitate that piece.
Excellent. So it's the need to really get to that chair. That's the person you really want to be garnering a strong relationship with in this feedback loop to turn things around. Is that my understanding?
Exactly right. Yes.
Okay. All right. Excellent. And it's interesting too. So you talked in your article, Colleen, a lot about, we all know there's various touch points in the hiring process, and it's exceptionally important. And we've talked about this in other table talks to exude the mission and the values of the organization, right? And it's critical to be consistent in that process. And you have shared some things in your article about when companies, organizations don't get it quite right. Can you share some of those with us?
Sure. Well, I mean, we all know in every aspect of life, first impressions really do make an enormous difference. And it's the same thing when it comes to candidates. They are evaluating their employers and they're looking for their next, long-term home. And so, they're evaluating the hiring leaders and the company and the process as well. And I have one that just really would not recommend this approach. So I had a hiring leader who knew that their executive leadership team was pretty tough. And so the way this hiring leader approached interviews was by treating the candidates very poorly, by being really tough on them during the interview process to see if they could handle that type of situation. And that approach did not work. I would not recommend that approach because what that did is every candidate withdrew after the interview. They did not appreciate being treated that way. And so, I counseled the hiring leader to utilize behavioral interview questions that would help identify whether the person would be successful in those types of challenging environments instead of treating them poorly during the interview process. So that's one example.
Excellent. No, that's great. That's where the expertise really comes into play, right? And that's a perfect example, those behavioral questions to kind of turn things around, I hope, for the future. Is that what happened? Did they turn it around?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, I had another client that, that was so engaging and spoke so positively about the company and showed such a genuine interest in the candidates that after every interview, every candidate wanted to come work for this person and come work for this company. And so that's the approach to take. You have to understand that, again, making those good first impressions is really important. And so we share that feedback with our clients so that they understand the importance of that piece during the process. You don't want to work so hard to recruit someone and then lose them during the interview.
Great example of how your expertise and just the feedback loop there really made a difference. Now, Sharon, we all know that salary plays a big part, and the communication of salary and understanding market data and understanding where things plays a big part in communicating to candidates and communicating to hiring leaders, because many times companies don't know the market value for certain positions. You wrote about this in your article, and I'd like to hear from you on how when you're learning that candidates, something is, company is lowballed, let's say a position, how do you go back and turn this around to their favor and to the candidates' favor?
Yes, we have all been experiencing the compensation piece. It certainly has been a big talking point here for the past few years. And it goes along with some of the things that Kristin and Colleen were sharing. Feedback is so important, and we do it all the time. you get one chance to make that first impression. So I'm going to just start right out here, and I included this in my article. I'm just going to go there with Taylor Swift, because giving feedback, it's delicate, because it's delicate, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? So that being said, I was having a delicate conversation even this morning with a new CEO that I'm working with, and I have 2 positions now, and they have an urgent need. They're critical positions. And I felt like, wow, he's really rushing this process. Let's make sure that we are all on the same page here and understanding and explaining that we will be gathering compensation information. Good thing here is on one of the positions, they feel one is a chief role and the other is a VP. They feel that they're concerned that their salary may be low. So that was helpful that he recognized that right out of the gate. However, with us doing our research and we're already starting to hear and see things, I had to go back to him the next day, which was today, and really give him something. So he knows in what I call that we're going to gather our information and we're going to show him the evidence. Show him what's out there, what we're hearing, because a lot of times they don't know. And this happens to be someone who recognizes that he may not know and wants to learn.
Wow. I thought you were going to break out in song there for a second. We missed your golden opportunity. So it's delicate, isn't it? That's really cool.
Isn't it?
So along with the empathy, the expertise, we have to be delicate, right? And we have to provide the data. And that, again, it shows that expertise that a recruiter can really bring into the mix. And it's fundamental. I assume, and I guess you guys can tell me, you all have had experiences like that. Would you be able to glean any additional insight on that compensation challenge and getting over the hurdle there?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, Sharon. It's so nice to have a hiring leader who's open to hearing that feedback, but sometimes we don't always have that. And in my experience, just about every position, there can be an adjustment in that range, maybe with the exception of government jobs, right? Because those they have budgets that are set along through the government process, and it's a lot more strict. But I think just through the research we're able to give that feedback to the hiring leaders, it really has been able to move a lot of my searches from almost a pause situation where we were not identifying the candidates that they wanted to see because their comp wasn't in line. And so sometimes we just have to almost prove it to our clients, right? Show it to them in a spreadsheet, give them some examples of candidates, and then usually we can move them forward. I haven't had a situation where we haven't been able to do that. Colleen, have you?
Yes. And I love hearing what you all are saying, because I think, giving feedback encompasses so much. However, one of the most critical components, especially these days, is giving feedback on what is the appropriate pay. And I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily have access to comp studies. They can be very expensive. And I think even those that do have access, the comp studies don't necessarily apply to their particular market or situation. And so they come to us just not knowing. And it's our job to give that feedback in real world data. And so we're showing them that competitive intelligence, and we're telling them, this is what you can get for these dollars, and this is what you can get for these dollars. And I did have a situation like that recently. It was a chief financial officer position, and the compensation range identified was not yielding the experience and the level of candidates that we needed. And our client knew what they needed in this position and in this next candidate. And so instead of skinning back on the requirements, they increased the compensation. And so they were able to make a fantastic hire. But it did take sharing that data and not just telling them. So we don't just tell our clients that you need to be at X number. we actually back it up by showing people who are doing that job and what they're currently earning. And that feedback has been, I think, incredibly helpful on pretty much all of our searches, is how we approach that.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a great
And
guide. Go ahead, Kristin.
I just want to add one more thing, and in addition to just, base salary, we're collecting, what potential bonuses they get paid, when those get paid, some of their benefits, 401k, what the match is. There's a lot that goes into that whole total comp piece. And candidates are savvy, like they know what it takes to make a move, and they want to hear the full picture. And if their next employer doesn't have pet insurance, like they got to factor that into what their expenses are going to be. And it's really a total comp picture, and we do try to gather all of that information.
And let's face it, we're giving feedback on not just the compensation, but what's most important to that candidate in terms of what is going to get them across the finish line. And sometimes, it's having more flexibility in terms of being, hybrid. Sometimes, to your point, Kristin, it's about having better benefits. So the feedback that we're giving isn't just relying on dollars in terms of compensation. It's just the overall feedback of what's important to that candidate in order for them to take the job.
Wow, you guys, these are great examples.
I had another example. I had one that just from 2 weeks ago was a CEO search as well. And the committee, then the candidate did the research, and speaking to, as Kristin said, how savvy that the candidates are. This particular person did do their research and gave a range of where she felt that the range should be. And that was what she was targeting. And it was out of our range. Her low end could have been stretched to where the committee had discussed if they needed to go there. So now we're in the negotiation stage, and the candidate just said to me, point blank, knowing what the current person in the seat is making, and is still coming in lower, but recognizing I'm going to be coming in and doing the exact same work that the person is currently doing. So I'm not sure I'm understanding why they see something different. And I thought that was a very interesting fact to point out. And we did move it to that higher range, which was just slightly above her low range. And that's what needed to happen. So that additional communication and learning on both sides. And I had one last week that was a leadership and operational role that it moved up $12,000 actually from the original. And they weren't understanding the scope. The hiring leader is not really a new position, but really it was an opportunity for them to upgrade it, but they weren't necessarily upgrading the salary. So the scope was pretty deep. When you have a mismatch there, you have to understand, again, that savvy candidate, they understand. And we want to come forward with putting our best foot forward in that initial meeting because we're promoting our hiring leaders in that interview process, but also in the delivery of the offer.
That's a
It's
great
your job, Sharon, to delicately point out.
Delicate. Because it's delicate, isn't it? There's so many layers.
There's so many layers to the delicacy of giving feedback. Absolutely. And those are great examples. And so I've got this question for you guys, and I'm sure you have a lot to say. But because the topic is giving feedback, right? And you've already, I guess, in a way, provided examples of how it really has steered outcomes in a way that to benefit the hiring experience. But if you can, when have you given feedback specifically to a hiring manager where it has actually impacted the hiring decision and the overall success of the process? Can you guys think of any specific examples other than the ones you've already shared, which have been great?
I was hiring for a CEO for a nonprofit in the accounting industry, and this was a replacement of a longtime CEO, so somebody who'd been in the position, I think, almost 20 years. So the board, it was almost like starting from scratch trying to figure this out. And they, in their mind, they felt like since it was accounting that they would be overseeing, that this person should have a CPA. And guess what? Those people were hard to find in the Valley. Going from maybe a corporate CPA position into like a nonprofit position, the salary range was a little bit too low for most candidates, or they just weren't interested, right? They wanted to stay on that career path. So I had made the suggestion, why don't we look at other associations within that same like professional services arena that might be helpful. And sure enough, we were able to generate more candidate flow, and they ended up hiring somebody that came from a nonprofit association for attorneys. And so again, similar skill set, thinking outside the box. That's all part of the feedback that we give them. And here they had somebody coming from an attorney profession, billable by the hour, just like CPAs, they consult just like CPAs. So it ended up being an excellent fit, and that candidate's still in his position. I think it's now 4 years later. So
Nice.
doing really well.
I love that, Kristin.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great example. I mean, I think I have a similar situation. It's going back a number of years, but it was a perhaps you mentioning a nonprofit CEO. Obviously, we do a number of those, and we had a slate of candidates who were all like to like of exactly what the company was and exactly what the search committee was asking for. But then we, very late in the process, right before they were about to start interviewing their slate, we had a candidate who was a total out of the box candidate, surface, and the person was just different than everybody else. And due to the timing, the search committee was, we're good with who we have. And I really needed to give the feedback of, I know that we've set our slate, but I believe that we would really be missing out if we didn't include this particular person. And the feedback that I shared and the reasons why did allow that search committee to be open to interviewing that late entry, if you will. And ultimately, that person is who was hired. That person's been in the role and been incredibly successful for 6 years now, has increased the revenue of the company significantly, has won so many awards. And I think back to and just think I'm so glad that I really pushed on giving that feedback to the search committee. Otherwise, I think we would have missed out on a great hire.
Nice. Great example. Great example. Other examples before we move on to the questions from the audience. Okay. All right. Well, we had a few questions come in that I'd like to share with the group. And one of them is pretty interesting. How do you address when the client or hiring leader, has a bad reputation in the market? Oh, wow. That's something we definitely don't want to miss out on talking about, because it happens and they're not aware.
Yeah.
So who wants to take that question?
I have a great example of that. Well, so I've learned my lesson to check Glassdoor reviews as I start searches for brand new clients because of this situation. I did have a client who had quite a few bad Glassdoor reviews, and not only were they negative reviews, but then how they responded to the comments that were made there were not exactly they could have done it a lot better, right? So the good news is the things that had kind of happened in the past to generate those negative reviews had changed. People had left, their culture had been refreshed, and people were happy. So unfortunately, that's still living on the web, and we needed to make sure that got cleaned up. So they went in and did, through me pointing it out to them, people are looking at this, back to the savvy candidates, right? They're doing their research on these companies before they make the leap. So so that was able to be rectified. They cleaned up some of their comments, and then we were able to pitch the positions, explain to them this is things that have been happened in the past. They're in a better space today, and be able to recruit some candidates for them.
Great example. Great. Anybody else want to share before we go to the next question? Okay, the next question has to do with how do you give the feedback? What's your typical format? Do you give it in writing? Do you give the feedback one-on-one with the hiring manager or to the committees? What's your preference there?
I personally prefer the verbal feedback. I really like when we have scheduled search update meetings with clients. We tend to, on a lot of our searches, schedule them bi-weekly. And sometimes we're only in those meetings for 5-10 minutes. It can be a quick check-in. Other times, if we've got a lot of candidates to talk about and we're at a certain stage in the search, but that allows, I believe, having that verbal communication. And also, it may not be a scheduled meeting. You might just need to pick up the phone and call somebody. There are certainly those instances where we need to provide feedback, probably doing so daily, all day long via email. However, there are going to absolutely be those scenarios where a verbal conversation is needed, especially with sensitive and negative information that can be difficult in writing. But then you also have to make a judgment call. Sometimes you need a paper trail, depending on what the situation is. You might want to put it in an email. So those are just some of my thoughts. So no one size fits all here.
Great takeaway there, Colleen. Great takeaway. And the next question kind of plays into the question before, and that has to do with how often do you connect? You kind of answered what you're doing, Colleen, the bi-weekly check-ins. But this particular question has to do with that the hiring manager is often not available. So what do you do in that respect? How can you help people in that position?
I try to, if I know that someone is, I try to get their schedule up front. Are they traveling a lot? That it's a partnership. And sometimes we're gathering information in real time. It could be feedback after an initial interview. And that gives us time to make a quick pivot, to continue going back to, you just get that one chance at a first impression. And I delivered feedback again yesterday on another search where the CEO dressed casually. And I received a comment from one of the candidates that they were surprised, as I was too, when I was part of the debrief and we were doing a virtual meeting. And so brought this attention now for the final interview. And little things like that, we're always selling. Yeah. Selling them, they need to be selling themselves as well.
This has just been an extremely powerful recruiter table talk. I wrote notes today just to follow all the great insights you've provided. It's really been very powerful. I want to thank all of you for that. I want to thank the audience for the questions that they asked, because they were very insightful and really spoke to the topic itself. I think my takeaway is that, once again, if you are in a recruiting role, recruiters are critical to the success of the hiring process. And if you're a hiring manager looking to work with a recruiter, it's very important to bring in the expertise, build a rapport, listen to that expertise, because as you can tell, there's so many elements, so many variables to the hiring process that can go wrong. And without listening to that expertise and that experience, you really get yourself in the best possible position to identify the best possible talent. So I really hope you took notes during this particular session. I thought it was very powerful. And I hope you understand that all of these individuals are here to be reached out to. Should you have any further questions, they've got articles on a number of different topics. So I'd like you to reach out to them for sure for their future expertise. And I'd like you to key into us again at the next Recruiter Table Talk and share the value of what we're doing with your network. We would really appreciate it. We will be back next month. And in the meantime, please follow us on LinkedIn and all of our social media outlets. You've been great. We love this format. We love the audience. And I particularly love being a part of it. So thank you so much. And we'll be back next month. Thanks again. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Keep it delicate. Keep it sweet. Keep it empathetic.
Remember, it's delicate.
Have a great day.